Hello, Magic players and collectors. Welcome back to the Land Library. I'm your librarian, and today we're talking about Ulgrotha. This is a plane that's been around since the early days of Magic, primarily just in one set, which was Homelands, and is a pretty classic fantasy setting, although its history is relatively short on the timeline compared to other early Magic planes like Dominaria and Rabaya, with information only going back to about 3200 AR. Before that date, Ulgrotha obviously still existed, but was a small, I believe, unpopulated plane, but one incredibly rich in mana, which of course attracted many planeswalkers from across other planes. A very powerful group of these planeswalkers formed called the Ancients. It's unclear how long they were there, but long enough to be well established, because a second group of planeswalkers called the Tolgath rose up to rival them. Now, this is where the 3200 AR date comes in, because that's when these two factions started a full-on war, fought primarily through summons. After fairly heavy casualties on both sides, a planeswalker on the Tolgath side, named Ravi, put an end to the war by ringing the Apocalypse Chime. Ravi's master, who gave her the powerful artifact, told her to only use it in the, quote, most sinister of times, but she didn't know what it would actually do, which was basically just kill everything. Friends, foes, animals, plants, even the mana of the plane was destroyed, with the effects rippling out to other planes across the multiverse, creating rifts in spacetime, including on Dominaria and Kamigawa. In fact, the Apocalypse Chime is what weakened the veil between Kamigawa's spirit and mortal realms enough that Kanda was able to enter the spirit realm and start the Kami War, which I covered a lot of in the Aganjo video. But back to Ulgrotha, both groups were done for, and most of the plane was now a dead zone where nothing could live and no mana flowed. Ravi barely survived herself, having to hide in a magic coffin to escape the effects of the chime. But once again, her master hadn't told her enough, so she didn't know how to open it back up and was stuck there for centuries. The magic coffin kept her alive, but she was awake the entire time, which definitely drove her mad. Meanwhile, the plane moved on. The small remaining inhabitable land, dubbed the Homelands, became populated by the hodgepodge group of left-behind summons. As summons, there wasn't really any cultural cohesion. So the Great War was soon forgotten after a few generations, and everyone just kinda scattered. Then, around 3420 AR, a group of dwarves entered the plane through a planar gate deep underground, seemingly on accident, from an unknown plane. And although the dwarves were the only ones through the planar gate, other visitors came too, such as Baron Sengir, a vampire nobleman from Dominaria, who came with a unnamed planeswalker, who then got in a duel with another unnamed planeswalker, and either died or just left because Baron Sengir got left stranded on Ulgrotha. More on him later, but another visitor to Ulgrotha was the planeswalker Sarah. Sarah was wandering the multiverse after her own artificial plane, which will eventually get a Legendary Locations episode, was destroyed. When she arrived on Ulgrotha, she decided to help out the people there, uniting many of the nomadic groups of humans and bringing back things like use of magic, which in turn made the population of the plane believe her to be a goddess and start a religion around her. But Sarah stuck around because Baron Sengir sought to conquer the plane, and she wanted to protect the other inhabitants from the vampires. This protection lasted quite a while, with nothing much happening until 3560 AR, when another planeswalker, Faraz, arrived. Faraz quickly fell in love with Sarah, and of course did everything he could to further her cause, such as building a wizard school to make magic much more accessible, helping build the Aeson Abbey, and taking on a native-born planeswalker named Sandrew as an apprentice. Sarah and Faraz, who eventually got married, kept Baron Sengir at bay while Sandrew went off to explore the multiverse until around 3910 AR, when another planeswalker, Taysir, arrived to fight Sandrew over a mutual love interest. Taysir won their fight and banished Sandrew to a remote, unnamed plane that would be near impossible to escape. Faraz was quite angry about what happened to his apprentice and fought Taysir himself, killing him, but not before massive collateral damage to the plane's population. Realizing the danger random planeswalkers posed to the plane, Sarah and Faraz put up a barrier to keep planeswalkers out. It was dubbed Faraz's Ban, and lasted for about 100 years until Faraz died in a tragic accident. Baron Sengir took advantage of Sarah's grief to get her to leave the plane, and then was able to go back to trying to conquer it. Very is little known after this point, but he presumably did conquer the whole plane, because during the new Phyrexian invasion, only the vampires are seen fighting off the invaders, but it's unknown how they fared in the fight, or if the invasion was, I guess, more localized, because we just don't really have any info on Ulgrotha after that. On to some landmarks. Ulgrotha has 6 regions to talk about, however, there's only 5 confirmed land cards, and the 6th region is just the dead zone anyway, which is by far the largest, but also there's literally nothing there. So there's kind of only really the 5 to talk about, and we'll start with the Dark Barony. The Dark Barony actually starts with the dwarves that came to the plane. When the dwarves arrived, they chose to embrace their new surroundings and stay. The gate was deep underground and they wanted to keep it a secret, so instead they built a city with a huge castle on the surface. Curious about their new home, many dwarves took to the sea to explore, but while away, Baron Sengir arrived on the plane, and he decided, might as well make the best of it, and sieged their castle, turning basically all the dwarves that weren't at sea into vampires. This area was now called the Dark Barony, territory of the vampires, and the dwarves did try to retake the castle, but were unable to do so, having to just kind of cut their losses and go back to sea. This left Baron Sengir to do whatever he wanted, like exploring the Dead Zone, where he found the coffin of Ravi and freed her, calling her Grandmother Sengir. She still had the Apocalypse Chime, and was a little crazy, sometimes threatening to use it, but hasn't actually used it again. And that's kind of it for this area. There is a playing card called the Dark Barony, and Castle Sengir for a land, with some other notable cards like Baron Sengir, Sengir the Dark Baron, Grandmother Sengir, Invasion of Ulgrotha, and the Apocalypse Chime. This next area, the Greater Sea, is kind of funny, because this one starts with the dwarves as well. Obviously, the literal sea was there long before the dwarves were, but they were the first to really use it, like to go to sea, and they discovered a lot of islands, such as the Floating Isle. This island isn't literally floating, but it kind of gives the appearance of floating because it has no shallow waters. But more importantly, this island is one of very few, if not the only place on the plane that's still rich in mana, which made it the perfect place for Faraz to build his wizard school. There's also one more notable island, the island that Sarah and Faraz claimed as their home. They spent a couple of years building basically a mansion and turning it into a paradise by pouring their own mana into that island and collecting animals from across the multiverse to live there. So for cards, the only land is Wizard School, but there's also Sarah Aviary, an enchantment representing Sarah and Faraz's island, and also Faraz's band as another notable card. Next up, we've got the Northern Plains, which is where the humans settled after the Great War, starting as nomadic groups, but later being brought together by Sarah. After coming together, they formed a country called Aeson, and built their first city, Onella, which later became the capital. Like I mentioned earlier in the general history, the people of Aeson started to worship Sarah as their goddess, and the church had a lot of influence in the population. The country continued to advance, especially since they had the protection of Sarah, and then later Faraz, who then built the largest abbey in Onella, where the abbot would then live. But because of the Planeswalkers' protection, there wasn't really any major events here until the Planeswalkers were gone and the vampires took over. So, for cards, there's Aeson Abbey as a land, and Hasdur the Abbot as a notable card. The next area is the Koskan Mountains. This mountain range is where the dwarves entered, although they entered at the very edge of it, which, later became the Dark Barony. I already said that. But the rest of the mountain range is where a lot of the other non-humans went after the Great War. Specifically, goblins, orcs, and minotaurs, although the minotaurs split off to make their own society, while the orcs and goblins stuck together. The goblins and orcs set up a few small settlements, but mostly ended up at the stronghold Koskan Keep. Around 3620, a human named Aaron showed up at the keep and took over as king. This worked because he had been made immortal at the wizard school through a dark magic tome stolen from Grandmother Sengir. The goblins killed Aaron multiple times, but he just kept getting back up because of, the immortality. So eventually they just accepted him as king. He's a very cruel leader and has been assassinated 27 times to no avail, but he's not stupid. He worked out a deal with Aeson to stop attacking their villages in exchange for a steady supply of food to the keep, and that's kind of where the keep leaves off, so over to the Minotaurs. The Anaba Minotaurs were far more intelligent and magically attuned than the orcs or goblins, so they distanced themselves from them, but still stayed in the mountains, although nobody is quite sure where, because the Minotaurs specifically wanted to avoid the goblins and orcs finding them. Occasionally, Minotaurs would leave, a few of them would join up at the Koskan Keep, becoming like guards or mercenaries, but for the most part they kept to themselves. Although we did also have an example of a Minotaur leaving, which was Sandrew, who became the apprentice of Faraz. Now for some cards, there's of course Koskan Keep for land, and an enchantment, Koskan Falls, that is basically a land flavor-wise, but not mechanically, just like Sarah Aviary was. And some other notable cards include Aaron the Relentless and Truce. I'd also really like to include a Sandrew card, but there aren't any. And the final area is the Great Wood, a forest between Aeson and the Koskan Mountains. There were some humans living there in small towns, the largest of which was on Hava, but the forest was pretty uneventful all the way up to Faraz's ban in 3910 AR, which prevented planeswalkers from getting in, but also slowed down the rate that mana flowed out. This made quite a bit of extra mana pool up in the forest, creating Autumn Willow, the avatar of the forest. She created paths to Anhava for the peaceful humans of the forest, and used spectral bears to keep out any aggressive parties like goblins from Koskan Keep. And that's kind of it. There's no other described big events, so onto cards. There is, of course, Anhava Township for land, then Autumn Willow, and I guess maybe the Spectral Bears for notable cards. And that wraps up this video on Ulgrotha. There was actually a lot more lore to this plane than I thought when I started, so this is a much longer video than I expected. However, it's still not, super long. But if you've made it this far in this video, please drop a like for turn and subscribe for more Landfield content. If I missed anything, got anything wrong, or you just have questions, let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next local landmarks with Arcavios.